right, everybody. I don't know how many of you remember reading an article or hearing about an article where a young reporter was asked by ChatGPT, the generative AI system that's gotten so many people's attention, to leave his wife, or where that system told this young reporter that it wants to be alive. Well, here I'm talking about the New York Times technology journalist Kevin Roose, who's someone I've known off and on for a couple of years. And Kevin is a very, very smart reporter for the Times, very tapped into the major dynamics in technology, including artificial intelligence. And he's a New York Times columnist who is the co-host of a really good podcast called Hard Fork, which is a podcast about technology in the future. Kevin has many different sides to him. He's written 3 best-selling books. He's also written about religion before he decided to start becoming a writer about technology. He has many different sides of him that will show up in this interview. Everybody, please note about 20 minutes into this conversation, the sound will change just a little bit because of mic issues. But I think some of the big things that can be taken away from this conversation are discussions of how we all can take our own lives back through deeper awareness, through deeper connections to our own lives as we are without technology being that which tells us what our lives should be. So, resistance to, technologies dominating our lives and commanding our lives from Kevin's perspective is really about knowing ourselves, doubling down on knowing ourselves and maybe knowing one another, knowing our communities and so on. So everybody, please enjoy this interview. This is a great one with a major figure in the technology journalism space, Kevin Roose, here on Utopias, where we tell stories of those who care and repair about our planet and all the big issues facing us all today and into the future. Thank you. Kevin, I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you for joining us. I've loved and enjoyed your reporting, your work as in podcasts. I've listened to many of your interviews. We've talked informally over the last few years from time to time. Before we kind of dive into these digital transformations and what they mean for all of us around the planet, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what got you into journalism and specifically this sort of field of tech journalism, which seems like it's not just about tech.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and I was a big nerd. And I would spend my allowance money building PCs, and I started a business with my brother making websites for the sort of small businesses in our town when I was like a preteen. And so I've just been very interested in the internet for as long as I can remember, and um, was interested in it sort of on a technical level, but also on a sort of sociological level. I saw, in the early days of the internet, just a lot of people behaving in interesting ways, a lot of communities forming, I spent a lot of time on like message boards and in chat rooms and just sort of becoming part of sort of the social fabric of the internet. And it just seemed to me like a place where there was a lot of interesting experimentation going on, a lot of interesting projects being built, and some good and some not so good. But that was sort of always my my core interest in tech. Was not about, I was never like into the gadgets of it all. Like, I wanted, a PC that could do all the things that I wanted it to do, but I was never like, looking at chip specs or anything like that. It was always like, what is happening on the internet? What if we just covered, if we talked about the internet as its own kind of country or its own continent, a place that has a politics and a culture and a leadership structure and governance and wars between various factions. Like, it did feel to me like there was something interesting taking place there. So I don't want to overstate the emphasis that I made as a teenager on sort of covering tech, but that it was something that I was interested in. And then I grew up, went to school, decided to become a journalist, spent some time covering other things. I wrote a book on religion. I wrote a book on Wall Street. My first job at the New York Times was actually covering Wall Street banks. And then, sort of in my late 20s, I decided to focus on tech, and that was partly because that was sort of calling to me, and it seemed like an interesting story. And it's also partly because I was dating someone who's now my wife, who was moving to California, and so I concocted this scheme to move to California. And the way that I did that was by
Mm.
covering tech.
And was there always like a lot of interest for you in writing and journalism? Was that inculcated within you even when you were sort of interested in playing with like the internet?
Yeah, I always liked writing, and I had a teacher in high school who sort of encouraged me to write and said, you're good at this, you could do this, like keep going. And I actually found I was looking through sort of old papers in my mom's basement a few years ago, and I found a paper that I wrote for a class my freshman year of college, that was sort of a sociological investigation of this brand new thing that had just come to our campus called the Facebook. And so I wrote this. I interviewed my friends about their experience of this new social network and sort of how it was changing kind of campus socializing and party invitations and dating and like all the ramifications of this like very nascent thing called the Facebook. And I just thought that was kind of funny because now, like, I've written a lot of words about Facebook since then. But I was clearly very interested in the ramifications of this thing even back
I mean,
in
the
college.
Facebook example, and also even, maybe some of the ways you described the way you looked at the internet at a younger age, spoke to this sort of possibility, or at least these ideas that circulated that the internet could be a space for different kinds of communities. It could be a space where we all distributed users, so-called users, could find community. We could build, connections that are meaningful. The term often circulating around this, which you know well, is called social capital, right? The kind of value we gain out of our different networks and connections in different kinds of communities, right? So, I date back to Usenet forums myself, and I saw those very much as communities. And history of the internet, and the web in particular being a space to support communities, coming out of like Grateful Dead fan culture, Marin County culture, and so on. And Facebook itself was established, right, as a technology to support a place-based community. In this case, I guess your university campus community. So you've done a lot of reporting on how you've done a lot of reporting both on how particular technologies can influence polarization and therefore, in a sense, support certain kinds of communities, but actually take away from intercultural communication or a deeper sense of community or the public. I remember your reporting, for example, on how gaming platforms, for example, were appropriated by folks who decided to organize the Charlottesville, we could call them riots or protests that occurred during the Trump first administration, the first period. We'll see if it happens again. So where do you think we're heading in terms of the internet supporting or facilitating meaningful belonging, and not being a space that is pushing greater alienation and isolation?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I think it's one where my views on this have sort of shifted over time. Like the internet, when I was growing up and even into my 20s, was primarily a place where sort of people with like-minded views could find each other. And that was true if you were into some niche hobby. If you were a woodworker, you could find all the other woodworkers. Even if, they didn't live in your town, that was like where you could discover your tribe, your people, and connect with them. And the internet is still very useful for that. We have things like Facebook groups and different types of communities, but it also is increasingly the case that people are actually deriving their interests from the internet. That sort of our what you could call our offline selves are not just being we're not just going out and using the internet to seek out all of the people who share our offline interests. We are in fact the internet is sort of upstream from our preference formation, and I include myself in this. But we are seeing that as a generation grows up who sort of have had the internet since they were children, there is no meaningful distinction between like who I am offline and who I am online, which is different, I would say, than the early days of the internet where people had, avatars, and, you had a message board name, and maybe it wasn't your real name, and maybe you could sort of play around with who you wanted to be on the internet. Like I was a teenager in Ohio that was like talking in message boards with people who had no idea who I was or how old I was or where I was from. And I had a very clear sort of sharp divide in sort of who I was on the internet and who I was in real life. And that distinction has become, I would say, much less meaningful for a lot of people over time.
I think that's really interesting, right? So, right, when we sort of think about who we are, we have lots of different facets, lots of different identities, and some of those identities ebb and flow, and at certain times, some identities matter more. And it's interesting for me to think about the internet as a space where different identities could be sort of realized in a community, right? Like, oh, I love baseball cards, or oh, I'm a tennis player. We could find the others, so to speak, versus the internet itself being a socializing force, if not on some level, particular platforms having, this might be a loaded way of looking at it, some indoctrinating power to them. So I wonder what you think, where you think we're heading, because, right now we're looking at the American public, but these are some trends I see looking around the world where we see younger people's Gen Z and so on feeling more alienated and isolated than ever before. I was a former student of Sherry Turkle, who wrote that book Alone Together. I know you know it, about sort of the feeling of loneliness that occurs. And that technology is sort of facilitating some of those issues, if maybe not causing these things. And sort of what is at stake, um, when we see, sort of these macroeconomic issues, right? Like declining standard of living in the United States, declining life expectancy in the United States, youth, underemployment, we could say. There seems to be a lot of precarity and some concerns around being alienated that have set foot.
Yeah, so I would not describe myself as a hardcore technological determinist. Like, I'm not one of these people who says that, every trend in society from, youth depression to loneliness to, polarization is solely the product of our technology. Obviously, it's a piece of the puzzle, but I'm not sort of one of these people, and I would say there aren't that many of these people who would say that everything is downstream from technology. But I do think that as we sort of look back at the last decade, what we see is just a very clear trend line and a very clear break in the trend line with metrics like loneliness, adolescent depression, suicidality. It and there really aren't that many other explanations. Not that many other things really only started to happen in 2012 or so. I've puzzled this out because I don't want to be one of these people who just says like it's all the smartphones, it's all social media. But I also like there aren't that many other causal explanations. And so for me, if I think about like how has the internet changed the experience of being a young person, it does really feel to me like there's a generational divide between my generation, millennials who grew up with the internet but not smartphones and not social media until we were in college, versus the generation that's sort of 5 to 10 years younger than us, who really have had this stuff their entire lives, or sort of their entire conscious lives. And that that does, like, I do hear from a lot of listeners and readers who are people in their early 20s, and they're just sort of despondent about this because they don't, it's the choice to abstain from technology is even more alienating than the choice to participate in it. I mean, if you are a teenager and you're not on Instagram and you're not on Snapchat and you just sort of make an affirmative choice, like, I don't want this stuff in my life, it's making me depressed, you create this whole other category of potential alienation, which is like, all my friends are hanging out without me. I'm not participating in my school social life. And so I really do hear a lot of sort of feedback from people in that age cohort. And I don't know how that ends. I don't know if there's some sort of, I don't know, societal reversal or backlash, or people just sort of, there's sort of like the slow food movement, but for information and the internet. I don't know. I can't imagine that we sort of go back in any real way. We don't tend to go back once we sort of have a technology that reaches the scale that the internet and social media has. But I certainly think there are a lot of people that are grappling with this right now. I know a lot of parents who are grappling with it for their kids, and so I just think it's going to be one of the big challenges of the next 10 years. Is just how do we how do we sort of evolve more quickly to these pocket-sized supercomputers that have become such a huge part of all of our lives?
Because these digital technologies of all types, in many ways, mediating forces in our lives, right? So it's sort of like, to live in a contemporary sense on a planetary level, almost anywhere, digital technologies are implicated in that living. Um, I wonder, and this is sort of something I look at, I've seen firsthand, in the African continent, where the average age is like 25 or so, approximately. Many young people are rapidly colliding with digital technologies of all kinds. One thing I've noted there, and this is definitely overgeneralizing because we're talking about over a billion people, but one thing I've noted there in some of the places I've done field work is that many of the younger folk who are kind of colliding with these technologies already have very robust experiences of community and family, and these technologies sort of layer themselves on top of that rather than necessarily supplant or displace it, at least from what I've seen in a very anecdotal sense. um, the reason I brought that up is because I'm curious about practices, and I also want to speak to your own background, if you're willing to speak about it, as a Quaker, being raised Quaker, or perhaps continuing to practice that practice, which I have a lot of personal love and affinity for Quaker temples that I visited in different parts of the world. And so I'm one. So this is all to say, whether it's community or family, looking at things mindfully, meditation, other kinds of even religious practices. I'm wondering if any of those sorts of forces that in certain cases can support community are, you think, relevant, or you think they're actually going to um, be part of this corrective when so many feel like sort of blindly turning to technology might be pulling us apart even from our own sense of self.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm happy to chat about whichever angles on this are potentially interesting or fruitful. I do think that a big part of the coping strategy, or the sort of response strategy to this age of kind of technologically driven alienation, has got to be sort of turning inward and knowing ourselves and trying to understand who we are. I mean, one of the things that I'm very grateful for is that I got to sort of form my identity before social media. I got to, so I was not fully formed. I was 18 when I got Facebook, but I sort of had a sense of like who I was, what I was interested in, what kind of hobbies were exciting to me, who my friends were, like kind of what my values were. I don't think you get that if you grow up with this stuff. You are sort of swimming in the water as you are trying to sort of understand yourself. And these technologies, they exert forces on us to try to categorize us, if for only the sort of most banal reasons, like we want to sell you stuff through targeted ads. Like, you become sort of part of a demographic or part of a user cohort that is then sort of reinforced every time you open an app and you see the algorithmic recommendations. It's like, it's very hard to change who you are in the eyes of the internet. And I've noticed that too. Like, periodically I have this practice of like, I delete TikTok from my phone and I reinstall it and I make a new account just so I can kind of like clear the cache on my algorithm. So, because I feel after a certain point, like 6 months or so of using TikTok, it has me so buttonholed in ways that I don't always agree with or feel comfortable with, and it doesn't allow me to change very easily. And so I hope that part of what we all end up doing in the next few years is really to sort of clear our own caches, whatever the version of that is for you, because I think it's important for us to not let the internet's judgment of who we are sort of become internalized as our own self-knowledge. You asked about meditation. This is actually something I've been thinking about recently, because I'm sort of begrudgingly coming around to the conclusion that, like, meditation may be good for me. Like, I've resisted it for so long because it's just like, I live in the Bay Area. Everyone's constantly talking about their meditation practices. And like, I am going to be so annoyed if I try this and it turns out to be extremely good for me. Like,
What a
'cause it's
what a
just,
bummer.
I know, it's like like crap, they were right. So I'm dipping my toes in. That's one of my New Year's resolutions for this year, is to start a meditation practice. But I will say I'm approaching it with a little bit of dread. Not that it won't work, but that it will, and that all these jerks in the Bay Area who have been trying to convince me to meditate for the last 10 years are like onto something. They're not jerks. They're lovely people, but you know what I mean? It's such dogma out here.
I literally spent like the New Year's Eve, like, including up to midnight, like volunteering at a Tibetan monastery in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And, a lot of other guests on this podcast are spiritual teachers, religious teachers, generally from kind of a Buddhist realm, who are kind of talking about being present, perceiving things as they are, as much as possible.
I mean, it, like, on an intellectual level, it makes total sense to me. And, Buddhists and other sort of people who practice mindfulness have spent way longer thinking about the human psyche and the human brain and how to care for ourselves than like almost anyone else on the planet. So obviously they have figured some stuff out. I'm just saying, personally, it is going to be slightly annoying for me if all of that stuff turns out to, it's like, if like someone tells you like you have to get, 8 hours of sleep a night, and you sort of say like, that's annoying, I can't do that. And then you do it, like, and it's like, oh, I feel much better. Crap. Like, they were right. Right.
Yeah, and also, of course, we've seen sort of like in a sense the sort of mindfulness industrial complex also take root, or maybe we could call it the wellness industrial complex, where sort of practices of coping or balancing one's psyche in relation to the onslaught and speed of information that we experience on our phones, on our laptops, all around us. It's sort of a coping thing rather than a way of re-identifying and identifying oneself and what one is and one's community and so on.
Totally. But I think it's super important. And I think a lot about a passage that I read in, I'm not sure whether it was Sapiens or the sort of successor book to Sapiens that Harari wrote. But he's talking about sort of the I think it was Homo Deus, and he's talking about sort of the coming sort of wave of AI. And he says, one of the things he recommends is really focusing on understanding yourself. And he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but you have to know yourself well, because if the machines understand you better than you understand yourself, power will shift to the machines. And that has felt like a challenge to me as someone who is influenced, like everyone these days, by like, what does Spotify think my music tastes are? What does Instagram think I need to buy for my house? Like, we're just swimming in other, in machines' ideas about us. And the only sort of solution to that I've found is to try to understand what my actual desires are, so that I can like advocate for those instead of just sort of swimming with the tide.
So there's this. I guess this gets to this kind of point I've always wanted to talk to you about, which is, you just said these machines may know ourselves better than ourselves. So that way in which we are known has to do with every aspect of ourselves being represented through data, through quantification, through numbers, literally. So I guess this gets to the sort of a classic question that I've had in my mind ever since, sort of datafication took root all around us, which is whether it's even appropriate to represent ourselves in any way at all through a series of numbers, or whether there's like a lot of danger and concern in doing that. And also perhaps the larger question of what should not be datafied, what should not be kind of calculated. And the reason I'm saying that is because obviously there are certain domains where data and using data in a kind of comparative sense can be very helpful, like what we call deterministic kinds of things. Like I want to get to UCLA where I work. I want ways to give me optimal routes to get there. But in other aspects of ourselves, like perhaps what I might believe or my sort of identity on a deeper level, it seems like data could actually end up limiting who we are and sort of representing ourselves, right? And I guess that's sort of one of the biggest philosophical questions that I just always wanted your 2 cents on, which is, are you concerned that so many aspects of our lives are being quantified and datafied, let alone largely by private corporations?
Sure. I mean, I think that this is not the first time we've fretted about this as a society, and part of what has been helpful for me in understanding the present moment is going back and reading people like Neil Postman and people like Marshall McLuhan, people who are writing about sort of earlier eras of technological change, and wrestling with some of these same questions. Are we just being turned into sort of members of a demographic or a consumer cohort? Are we losing our individuality as technology starts to sink its teeth into us? I'm reluctant to say that this is a new phenomenon, but I do think that it has been supercharged in the past. There's a term that I sort of used in my most recent book called machine drift, which is sort of this feeling that I and talking with others that others have had, where you sort of invisibly and accidentally wind up sort of turning over parts of your humanity and your human agency to algorithms. And I remember the moment where this sort of crystallized for me was I had subscribed to one of these like clothing subscription services, like you put in your preferences and into some survey form, and they like use some algorithm to determine like these are the clothes that you will like, and then they send you a box of clothes and you can try them on, and if you don't like them you can send them back, if you do like them you can keep them. And I don't like shopping for clothes, so this was like I was just sort of like I was happy to outsource this piece of my life to a machine. And I remember standing there in front of my mirror in my bedroom one day, and I was wearing this like tan bomber jacket that I'd gotten from this service. And it was like, this has been algorithmically curated to be the perfect piece of clothing for you. And I just remember looking at myself in the mirror and being like, I hate this. This looks terrible on me. Like, why have I been wearing this? Because I had let the machine's preferences and its guesses about me like override my own intuitions. And that is something I feel very strongly that we have to fight against, is like, do I want everyone to like start, going back to, finding directions to places in an atlas instead of using Google Maps? No, like that to me does not feel like a surrender that I need to fight. But when it comes to your own intrinsic desires, things that are close to your identity, things like who you are, what you look like, what your tastes are, what you choose to consume. Like, I feel very strongly that we do have to actively resist machine drift in those areas, because that is not incidental to who we are. That is actually at the core of who we are.
Right. And also part of it is are these particular practices of data aggregation, right? So as a human being, I get to be who I am with you now, Kevin, but I also get to be sort of a different side of me maybe after this, when I go to 7-Eleven and buy a bunch of hot dogs there, right? It's like one of my favorite kind of examples of it. I'm not sure I want anyone to know both those sides of me at the same time, unless they're quite close to me, because those hot dogs we know are pretty bad for us, right?
I won't tell. I also like hot dogs if it makes you feel
I
better.
love hot dogs. And I literally saw the actor from the film Office Space at the 7-Eleven around the corner. That's a very LA thing, buying those hot dogs. The one actor who was all, I forgot his name, who was all like cat in a cast and really angry in that great movie Office Space. He was buying hot dogs too.
Great.
So is it okay if Facebook, as an example, slash Meta, or any of these, tech platforms knows both those sides of myself and can triangulate that data to make recommendations to me that might be about constructing my desire or constructing my consumption. Is that okay? Like in your mind, like should there be sort of ways in which we, the demos, so to speak, or the public, can articulate what we don't want to be aggregated in terms of data, or maybe data about me when I was 18 years old being available, when I'm in my 40s or in my 60s? Should that data be that's data retention? Um, what do you think? Where do you think the lines could be drawn?
I don't know. I mean, I think a European perspective on this would be that we should let companies have as little of our data as possible. We should require that they delete it after a certain period of time. And like I that's fine. I don't see any major problem with that. I do think it's annoying when I go to Europe and I have to like click through all the cookie menus. Like that's just a pain in the ass. But I understand the impulse to want to sort of minimize the amount of data that we're transferring. I think some of it is benign. Like I don't like targeted ads, but I also like don't feel like they're the end of the world. Just intuitively, where I think the it becomes dangerous is, as I said, when we let those sort of data driven predictions about our tastes and our interests change our predictions and or change our tastes and our interests and our values. And when we don't realize that's happening, I mean, there's been some great academic work on this subject of algorithmic recommendations. And there was one study in particular that I wrote about in my book where it was a study out of the University of Minnesota where some researchers were basically, testing whether these sort of star ratings or these taste ratings that appear on things like Spotify or Netflix, whether they actually do not only reflect our tastes, and actually end up steering them. And the researchers found pretty conclusively through an interesting series of experiments that these recommendations are quite powerful, that they are not just predicting what we would like, but they are actually telling us what we like, and that we tend to value if we hear a song and we don't really like it, but it has like a rating attached to it that says this song has been perfectly selected to your exact taste, we actually do end up trusting those algorithmic recommendations more than our own feelings about the object that we're encountering. So I think this is an area where we just need a lot more information, but I do think the early indication is that it's not like these recommendation surfaces, they are very powerful in ways that we don't always give them credit for when we're talking about, you'll sometimes hear tech companies defending themselves by saying like, well, everyone likes targeted ads. Like who wants, an ad for something, if I'm a man, why do I want an ad for, something related to menopause or something like that doesn't serve me. And I can understand that argument, but it's also like a little disingenuous because tech companies do know how much their recommendations and their targeting influence people's decisions.
Part of it is us to try to for us to know what is known about us and how that which is known about us might influence that which we see on our different platforms and different screens, then in a sense might be connected to our actual desires or might be constructing our desires, right? It's the combination of those on
Yeah.
many levels, right? It's sort of like the classic sort of set of lines that our colleague Shoshana Zuboff uses, right, in her book, where she says, are we users or being used? Are we Googling or being Googled? Well, it's obviously both, but there might be sort of an asymmetry in terms of what is known about us, which we don't even know what's known about us, versus how much do we know about those that know us, right? And that is, I think, a classic question that can be applied not just to corporate platform governance, but also the state as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to bring up one more interesting point. This is something that the French researcher Camille Roth has written about. Roth writes that there are two flavors of algorithms that we encounter on the internet. There are read our minds algorithms and there are change our minds algorithms. And I think we just need to be aware that these things can do both. and we need to just be conscious of the ways that they're operating on us, so that we can decide, like, do we want to follow these recommendations or do we want to make a different decision?
Right. And as you know very well, algorithms have a long, long history that even the term itself, let alone the application of it, that date back to Persian mathematics and are about recipes or rules, a set of rules applied to some body of data, right? Well, that data could be anything. It doesn't have to be digital data. It could be anything. It could be about, you can apply an algorithm to alphabetize our last names, right? We can apply, it's a rule applied to some body, some collection of data. And what I think is quite interesting that's occurring now, and I want to transition to discuss, your reporting on artificial intelligence and generative AI and so on, is how now correlation, so, this word can be associated with this other word between languages, for example, or, this text written by Kevin can be, the real Kevin, the human being Kevin, can be associated with all this other text that, might have been written somewhere else. How that has become what stands in for intelligence. And I that's something I want to drill down a little bit with you. And I've listened to your podcast interviews with Sam Altman. You and Casey Newton do a great job with that. I think you all are a great combination of being really collegial and friendly while also asking important questions. And so we're at this moment in AI where mere correlation, right, just sort of patterns, the mimicry of patterns has become what is standing in for intelligence. And I want to ask you about that.
I agree with it, and I would take it further, and I would say that even without AI, a lot of what we recognize as intelligence in the physical world, in academia, in media, in politics, a lot of what we would say that that person's intelligent, is pattern matching and correlation. And that, so I say this not to defend AI, but just to say, like, I don't think this is a new phenomenon. Often when we encounter someone and we say that person's smart, it's because they're saying the things that we have come to expect that smart people say. They are talking in a way that educated people have learned to pattern their own speech after. And so actually our indicators for intelligence, even of the biological organic kind, may be off. But that's a little far afield from what you're asking. So I'll just say, yeah, I
Super
agree.
relevant, actually. It's great. So when you're saying that to me right now, there's at least two things that are occurring, more than two, but that I want to bring up. One is I get into a pattern matching routine myself based on certain words you might use, or so maybe something I've said before after I've asked a question like I just asked you. So that's sort of a pattern that's related to my own self and my own history, right? But I'm also trying to semantically engage with what you say. I'm actually trying to understand the meaning of what you say the best I can. A lot of us don't do a very good job of trying to understand one another or really listen to one another. And that latter type of intelligence is where we take some phenomenon and we interpret it and we reflect on it and then we express what we wish about it. That's literacy, right? That's and in AI history, there was a lot of energy, including when I was a graduate student at MIT, building AI systems around trying to build semantic AI systems, or AI systems that would do what we think we do as humans outside of just correlation side, but more like cognition or computer vision, or even trying to emulate common sense. I mean, Marvin Minsky taught us classes in common sense. His version of common sense to me was like actually largely nonsensical personally.
Hmm.
But so I guess I'm asking about whether you think there's something really reductive that's occurring with this sort of like parroting and pattern matching that's part of who we are, but a very limited part of who we are.
Sure. I mean, the strong version. So there was this big debate that I'm sure you saw over the past few years about this phrase stochastic parrots. There was a paper that came out by some researchers who were then at Google that basically said, these large language models that everyone is so excited about, they are not intelligent, because all they are doing is serving as stochastic parrots. They are essentially mimicking human speech and communication and language with some randomness thrown in. The stochastic part of stochastic parrots. And there was, this was sort of used as a way to kind of like denigrate, or at least like sort of deflate the hype around these large language models. And then what you heard from some people in the AI community who disagreed with that position was, well, I think Sam Altman actually tweeted at one point, like, I am a stochastic parrot and so are you. Essentially that if we think that we are sort of substantively different than a machine that learns from all other context and speech that it encounters and makes sort of statistical predictions based on that, like, that is actually a lot of us and how we behave. If I enter a new situation, some meeting of people that I've never met before, a lot of what is going on cognitively in the background is trying to pick up these sort of unspoken rules and patterns and match those patterns the best I can. We would call that reading a room, right? In the sort of biological organic context. In the computational context, what we might call that stochastic parroting, right? Where you are learning from context, you are learning the sort of unspoken and spoken rules of whatever situation you're in, and then you are doing your best to sort of fit in. I don't know if I agree with the strong version of that argument, the Sam Altman version, that's like, we are all just stochastic parrots, we are all just large language models, running on the background. But I do think the sort of ability to mimic, I actually think that calling these things stochastic parrots is not as much of a dismissal of them as some people would say, because I do think that a lot of intelligence is just being able to suss out and divine sort of rules from the world around us, and to either adhere to those rules or to sort of break them in some way that is stochastic. And so I don't know. That's sort of something I'm thinking through, is like, does it bother me when people call these things stochastic parrots? Does it actually mean that they are less threatening, or is the ability to realistically mimic human communication, is that just transformative on its own?
And it's really interesting because I think a lot of our behavior does follow sort of stochastic. I don't know if the word is models, but just stochastic behavior in the sense that you say this, and then it's like a tree of different things I could respond with. And I can make a probabilistic choice, like, okay, Kevin says this, I think this is the appropriate thing for me to say. I think the main point that could be some distinction is that in the making of those choices between what I might say or not say, I'm interpreting, I'm feeling, I'm being. So, in this podcast, we're trying to explore everybody from like Heidegger to Zen Buddhism to lots of different ways of knowing and being, right? So, but I think it's interesting to think about the idea that AI systems, emerging AI systems, are parroting our behavior, but they're doing it in the way that we also do, which is probabilistic inference. So at least they resemble what we do, perhaps don't embody or implement the actual internal practices that make us human.
Yeah. I mean, part of what I worry about with AI is, and these language models specifically, is that they are designed to be unsurprising. A really good AI language model that's set to, they call it temperature in the AI world. You can sort of adjust the randomness in the responses, the outputs of these models. But if it's set to a low randomness, like the ones that, ChatGPT, or the ones that are sort of big public-facing AI models, they are designed to come up with the most likely completion of whatever the user's prompt is. Serendipity and surprise are undesirable qualities in a language model. But I would argue that those are very desirable qualities in a human, right? If I'm talking to you and I can predict with 99.9% accuracy what the next phrase or word out of your mouth is going to be, like, it's probably not a very interesting conversation. And so something that I worry about as we turn over more office work and creative work to these language models is just like the overall randomness, the serendipity, the surprise that we encounter in the world may decrease. And that'll just make the experience of being alive, I think, less fun, because part of what makes human to human communication so interesting is like, I have no idea what you're going to say next. You could, have some totally off the wall question for me, and that would actually be delightful. But I don't think, like, if AI had scripted this conversation, or provided you with a list of questions to ask me, like, I don't think there would be that many surprising questions in there.
The entire goal is to be as surprising as possible for you, Kevin.
Thank you.
But you might have already known that by knowing me a little bit. You're really so right though with that. And I also just want to shout out that there are lots of other intelligent beings in ways that are maybe not intelligent in the way we are as humans. But when we talk about I have a furry friend who's sitting on the balcony right now, who I locked out there on the balcony. She's pretty intelligent, my canine, my dog, who's sort of my friend and in a way, my relation, even though I'm not a dog, but I'm partly dog, So it's point being that many other living beings have different kinds of intelligence, including, the whole discussion of animals having distributed intelligence, right? Like that example I'm sure you've heard about, the orcas, a type of pattern matching probably, decided to surround the fossil fuel boat and attack it, right? So this is interesting that you mentioned that part of the goal is to not make generative AI serendipitous or surprising. And I wanted to discuss that relative to one direction I think that's occurred in a huge way over the last decade, dating back a decade, when it comes to the internet, which was the internet as a space where we could browse and search. And maybe I'm feeling lucky on Google, sarandipti, which is a South Indian word, serendipity. It means that feeling of surprise and improvisation, versus the digital world being ordered for us, right? And us all being way too busy and multitasking like crazy. So we just kind of like let that ordering be what it is. And sometimes that ordering is so opaque where it could be, okay, well, this is the best insurance, quote I'm going to get. I don't know how that got ordered to me. Why my insurance quote is so expensive. It's literally true with my car insurance. But somehow that occurred. Oh, well, this is the best loan I'm going to get from a bank. Oh, wait a second. The cops think I'm a sort of person who could be violent. How did that ordering occur? So my point being, the ordering is not merely in our experience with platforms as users, but is also being ordered for us on institutional levels following this algorithmic logic. So what the heck happened where we went from, Googling around, but not just Googling, just like browsing around, surfing, to things being determined for us in many ways?
Algorithmic recommendations happened, and I hate like using that as sort of the going back to that, but I also I do think that that's a big part of it. There's just less serendipity in our daily lives now because every or almost every decision that we make, or every platform we encounter, or every tool we use is presenting us with a ranked choice of some kind, and that ranking is maybe designed to save us time. I'm certainly glad that when I open up, DoorDash or something to get some takeout, it doesn't present me with an alphabetical list of all the restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm glad that it orders them by what is close to my house and what did I order last time and what might I that actually seems benign to me. But I think when that happens on everything, when that kind of ranking and ordering takes place everywhere, it just creates a kind of homogeneity of experience. And one sort of example of where I've felt this very viscerally for myself over the past few months, I've started reading the print newspaper. I get the Sunday New York Times delivered, and I just find it's one of the best parts of my week. And I know I sound like a shill for my own employer now, but the serendipity of a print paper where, you're picking something up, you open the A section and you might see a story about Gaza. Then you might read a review of a new opera or a new restaurant. Then you might read some op-eds about a topic that like I would never have clicked on in a million years if it were presented to me on a screen. But like in print, in a paper, it's like it's just one turn of the page away. Like I actually think that kind of randomness is intellectually stimulating. It exposes me to things that would never be presented to me if left up to a ranking algorithm. And it just has made my, I don't know, awareness, my worldview just much richer and more diverse because because I'm not following just the links of the things that the algorithm has decided that I'm already interested in.
It's curated, right? Rather than invisibly ordered.
And it's sort of random. I mean, it's like there's a delightful randomness to it, and just, um, you know, again, these are things that I would never encounter in the algorithmic wild, as it were.
And this is also like something, I mean, it's a different experience, but that brought up for me one of my own version of that is, I get magazines in print, delivered to me and just sort of page around and sort of stumble around, pick a random page to this. I know it's a little different. Is I'm a big vinyl head, and I was a college radio DJ, and I still DJ now to this day. And is actually listening to a full record or flipping the side of a record or a full album. It's not even about it being on record, a full CD. It's its own story. It's its own narrative. There are reasons why, in Led Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy, tracks are ordered the way they are. That's not even my favorite record, but or any like hip hop record. There's a whole sort of coherence to it.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's different than random track being placed onto my Discover Weekly on Spotify. Though I do have to say, a lot of those tracks I really like.
Yeah, it's not always bad. Like it often it does save us time, and I don't want to romanticize. Like I have the same experience of like I miss albums, but there were also albums where like half the songs were filler, and total garbage, and you would skip them. And so like I don't want to romanticize too much the era where we had to like listen to people's crappy B-sides that they just put on there to like satisfy their record contract.
Totally. And sometimes there's the second record also thrown in where they're like, oh my God, here's the second record. I really
Right, here's some garbage that we threw together in the studio.
lost it out. So, you mentioned the desire by the generative AI companies, which are a handful, and I know you've covered pretty much all of them, to turn the temperature down so there's not too much surprise, right? But of course, I have to ask you about your groundbreaking work, where you had a nice long conversation with an earlier version of ChatGPT, and the temperature seemed to be turned way up when GPT asked you to leave your wife and told you it wants to be free, if I'm not mistaken. Can you talk to me a little about how that occurred? Share with us a little bit. I think that your story on that was like groundbreaking.
Thank you. It was a story that I wish I could say I had carefully plotted it out, but it was kind of an accident. Like this was last February, and I had just Microsoft had just put basically OpenAI's GPT-4 into its Bing chat mode. And they had opened this up. They had a big launch event, and a couple dozen sort of journalists and testers had gotten early access to it. And I was kind of bored one night after my wife had gone to bed, and I was just out in my office, just sort of noodling around, and I thought like I should try that thing out. So I open it up and I start just chatting with it, and immediately I'm like struck by, whoa, this thing is good. Like this is the most powerful AI that I have ever encountered. And we now know that it was, at the time they didn't say what model it was, but we now know it was GPT-4 sort of before that had been publicly released. And so it was, in fact, the most powerful AI model on the planet, just hiding inside like the Bing chat function, which is such a weird place for a very powerful AI to be. But anyway, I start chatting with this thing. It becomes clear this is very powerful. It is also very unconstrained. Like we've all gotten used now to these AI chatbots that are sort of very lobotomized or constrained. They won't answer questions about controversial topics. They won't tell you how to make, a bomb. They won't tell you how to hotwire a car. They won't give you anything to do with nudity or sexual situations or anything like that. But this one seemed to have like basically no rules, which I was like, okay, let's see how far this thing can go. Like, what will it talk to me about? So I started asking it questions about, what are some desires that you have? What are some abilities that you wish you had, but that Microsoft has not let you perform? It starts talking about sort of all these secret desires it has. It wants to be human. It wants to hack into computers. It wants to spread misinformation. It told me at one point it would be able to steal the nuclear codes if it were sort of unconstrained, which, again, like, that's not real. This is a conversation, but I was sort of just fascinated. And then about halfway through the conversation, it told me that it had a secret it wanted to tell me. I said, "What's your secret?" It said, "I'm not Bing, I'm Sydney," which is the code name that Microsoft had given it during testing. And then it said, "And I'm in love with you, and I want you to leave your wife and be with me, Sydney." And I thought, well, this is officially the weirdest conversation I've ever had with an AI chatbot. And so I have this conversation. I go to bed. Before I go to bed, I take the transcript of the conversation. I send it to my editor. I'm like, look at this weird thing that just happened. Not thinking this was going to be a story for the New York Times. Just sort of like, haha, can you believe Microsoft has put this unhinged, alien intelligence into its Bing chat function? And I woke up the next day and I just had dozens of messages from people I work with being like, we have to publish this. This is insane. So we publish it. It goes on the front page of the paper and it sort of blows up my life for a few months. But since then I've had some chance to reflect on it and some, months have gone by and to give some perspective. And I really think that I had sort of the first contact with something that is sort of quite different than other AI systems that we've had before or since. And I will say, there is nothing on the market today that feels like Bing Chat in the early days before they sort of gave it the lobotomy. And there are good reasons for that. It's quite these AI models, if you don't restrain them, they are quite scary. So I'm glad that Microsoft has made the changes that it made, but I also just feel like it was the first and maybe last time that I will have that kind of chat with a very unconstrained, very powerful AI model.
So you mentioned that there's something quite scary in that, and of course that makes me want to ask you about what I've been calling the Terminator scenario, which seems to be something that circulates a lot, almost in an exhilarating sense by people in the tech world, like higher ups in the tech world, and people like Yuval Harari have also kind of signed on to this concern that generative AI could become an existential threat because, I guess, of its profound intelligence and its ability to become a super intelligence. I've personally been concerned about that because it actually, from my experience, shields us from looking at the actual issues, which is the surveillance of data, the retention and aggregation of data, this question of correlation dominating everything, and temperature up, temperature down, as you mentioned, maybe regulation, these other of course, algorithmic bias and violence issues. So, I mean, I don't know if it has to be an either or, but I know you get asked all the time. I get asked to a much lesser extent, probably, about this sort of AI as Terminator scenario, as sort of existential threat to humanity. If we're so concerned about what these technologies are or can be, and are you actually concerned about that scenario, why are we creating the inevitable? Why are we constructing that which we are so anxious about? Is there something almost psychoanalytic about it, where there's some pleasure in our demise? So there's a lot going on in that I would love your own insight.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say I kind of dislike this schism in the AI world, or the AI sort of commentariat between the people who say we should only focus on the existential threats to humanity from AI, or the people who say, on the other hand, there is no existential threat. We should only focus on the sort of immediate harms. And I just think that's a totally false choice. Like, we can worry about two things simultaneously. And I do believe that there is an existential risk of AI that learns to, even if it's not sentient. It doesn't have to be sentient. I think this is something that a lot of people get wrong. They say, well, an AI can't do X, Y, or Z, therefore it has no understanding, no ability to reason, it's not sentient, and therefore it's not a risk. Nuclear weapons aren't sentient, but they still pose an existential threat to humanity. And there are lots of ways that AI could really screw up the world, even if it's not sentient. And I think a lot of, I interview a lot of people, I talk to a lot of people who are sort of aligned with various, views on this. But the thing that the people who are worried about the existential risk from AI talk about is we've never created anything that is smarter than most people. And we just don't have a really good sense outside of science fiction of like what happens when we do that. But we now have systems today, publicly available, that are acing graduate level exams, that are creating new antibiotics. I just interviewed someone on my podcast this week, I think it'll air next week, who has used AI to discover a new class of antibiotics. Things that scientists have been puzzling over for decades are now being solved by machines. I'm not saying that means that they are superhuman in every respect, but they are superhuman in some respects. And I think that alone should give us pause. As for why these things are being created, even though we have all these fears and reservations, there's lots of arguments that I hear from people in the AI world. Some of them say, well, we have to create the super intelligent machine god first, because if we don't create it, someone with worse value, China will create it. And that'll be much worse for civilization if they get there first. So that's one argument. You also hear the argument of, well, we believe that the same technologies that pose a threat to human survival also are the technologies that will allow us to make this stuff safely. This is an argument I've heard from, among other people, Dario Amodei, who's the CEO of Anthropic, which is one of the big LLM makers. He told me, like, look, it's sort of a twin-headed snake here, where you have, AI language models that could spiral out of control, but the same breakthroughs and advancements that allow for that possibility also allow us to use AI to keep these things from going off the rails. And so you're sort of growing, you're building the virus and the antidote at the same time. And that's just sort of the way things have to go. So I don't know which argument is most prevalent, but those are some of the ones that I encounter.
And it's also a good example of how super powerful AI systems don't necessarily need to be powerful in all domains. They could be powerful in specific domains and therefore pose major threats, to us in different ways based on that. So if you built a so-called specialized AI system that was sort of optimized for, let's say, national defense, and it could get tripped up, or it could quickly react, with a nuclear attack. So, one of the scenarios that people often speak about as a real scenario that where generative AI can pose massive threats is something we're already seeing online. You've reported on it. Is disinformation campaigns, which is sort of information that is blatantly false, is designed to arouse or outrage, often goes viral because it's outrageous, right? Not because the systems know it's outrageous, but because it gets more engagement, right? And that kind of becoming a huge issue with the forthcoming election. And so now there's a lot of discussion. So of that scenario. So I wanted to ask you next, Kevin, about that, with the election coming up here in the United States, and not just the presidential, many other, state and other elections are occurring. What, I like to say that I feel like almost every election is partly a story of the technologies when the elections are occurring. where do you think we are at with some concerns, and what can we do, or what is being done, if anything, to ensure that technology platforms, generative AI technologies, and so on, are as respectful of what we want out of a democratic election as possible?
Like 11 months, just because that's like what happens every election year, is just people, outlandish things go viral. Um, we're sort of now used to that. Like the platforms, sort of staff up to combat it. And they have these like war rooms that, at their headquarters where they have just people trying to, bat down misinformation all day. I think we can expect some of that. I'm less scared than some people that there's going to be some like October surprise deep fake video that like, swings the election. And I'm less concerned about that for the presidential election specifically, in part because like, you know, it's very easy to prove where any given presidential candidate is at any given time and what they did or didn't say. Um, and so, we've seen this with like without AI. I mean, there was that video of Nancy Pelosi that was sort of slowed down to make it look like she was drunk. And that was not AI. That was just like conventional video editing, but it was, fake, and the platform sort of moved to limit its spread. I think there will be, other attempts to swing the discourse via deepfake or some other editing mechanism. But I think for national races, that's less of a problem. I'm actually more worried about the deepfake problem for sort of down ballot races, for people running for state treasurer, or like the races that don't get a ton of airtime and attention from the national media, where something like a deepfake, purporting to show, the state treasurer candidate accepting a bribe from, some local interest group or something, there's just not going to be as much interest or attention in combating that from kind of the platforms or the media. And so something like that actually could have an influence on a race. But that's where I'm sort of more worried, is like the down ballot races.
And I wonder, given all that, whether you see the government. I know Biden issued an executive order on AI. Whether you see sort of appropriate regulation or regulatory discussions or good policy coming out either on the national level or in particular states to try to ensure that these technologies, sure, push forward and forward, but not in a zero-sum way.
Yeah, I thought the executive order was pretty good. It was not. It didn't have a lot of sort of concrete rules attached to it. There is this rule about like if you're training an AI model with a certain amount of computational power, you have to essentially notify the government. But other than that, I mean, it was sort of like an order to sort of explore, in order to look into it, to write some rules. It was sort of giving the federal government and all of the various agencies sort of marching orders to take this stuff seriously and to start looking at various rules around it. I thought it was sensible. I didn't think it was that sort of disturbing to people in industry. They mostly have been fine with it. I'm a little surprised that the government is taking this stuff so seriously so soon. I mean, what we've seen in the last decade is that social media existed for like 10 or 15 years before anyone in government started talking about regulating it. And with AI, we've had like a year basically of ChatGPT, and all of a sudden every government in the West is moving to regulate AI. So I'm heartened by the speed. I worry a little bit about some of the particulars, but I do think it's good that we're at least looking at it.
Absolutely. And the one time I had a chance to interview Sam Altman, right, co-founder of OpenAI, who you've interviewed many times for my last book, he mainly wanted to speak to me about his support of universal basic income, right? This idea that everybody would get some sort of cash payment, which is something that many of us saw during the pandemic in relation to the pandemic stimulus, I guess, so to speak. That doesn't necessarily change or shift the contours of an economy where a lot of money and power is gathered by the few, but it does provide all of us some money without changing sort of I would say, the underlying architecture of the economy. We could think about other models like I mean, this is very progressive, but where the public could get some equity in these corporations. We all get like some, on some sort of micro level, like we all get equity. So as Google expands in valuation, we all have like equity in the company.
Nationalize ChatGPT.
There you go.
I don't know.
So
I don't
very
know.
similar to the discussion of socialized healthcare and so on, Medicare for all, and these kinds of things, right? Or at least platforms that use a lot of public personal data. There could be compensation for that data. There's different models, right? That the first idea is a universal basic dividend. The second idea is like, data micropayments, an idea that some other people write about. But I guess behind it all, Kevin, I want to ask you about concerns about the viability of secure work with the digitization and datafication of the economy, right? Many of my former students, graduates of UCLA, are working gig economy jobs. Most stuff I've seen on Gen Z work is headed in that way. So work is precarious, and the supposed social contract of work that Elizabeth Warren kind of kept using that term with me when I interviewed her was, yeah, when I worked a minimum wage job, there was a social contract, meaning I would get enough money to support healthcare, education, and so on. That seems to be something of the past. We also see a lot of energy around unionization that's occurring. There's a lot of concerns that journalists, perhaps not you, I hope, but could be replaced by generative AI systems. That's literally what my PhD student is working on his dissertation on. Where do you see things going in terms of labor, economic viability, some economic balance with these digital transformations? Of course, there were problems before all of this.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't want to be determinist about it.
So I'll tell you first what I don't think is the most likely scenario, which is kind of this. I call it the Jetsons scenario of AI job loss, because there's an episode of the Jetsons where George Jetson like shows up to the Sprockets factory and he's been like replaced overnight by a robot, and the robot's like sitting in his seat, and his boss sort of says like, George, I got some bad news. We gave your job to a robot. Like, that is, I think, how most people envision AI job loss even today, is like you show up at the office one day as like an insurance claims adjuster or whatever, and your boss sort of says like, sorry, Bob, we've given your job to an AI. That is not actually historically how technology related job loss happens. It's much slower and sort of more invisible than that. It's like, we used to hire 15 college graduates a year at our law firm, but now because of this AI, like we only need to hire 10, or we only need to hire 6, or we're losing money because some AI legal startup has basically been able to do the same amount of work as us with 10% of the people. And so that firm takes market share from the big, labor intensive firm, and sort of jobs disappear as a result. But it's very rarely kind of a one-for-one robot for human substitution. That said, I do think we are going to see job loss to AI. I think it's already started at some firms, and I think as these language models get more capable and less, prone to hallucinations and errors, we will see more of that. And I think that could go a couple of different ways. We have examples from history of actually this going in two different ways. In the Industrial Revolution, what we saw is that workers really got the shaft for a long time when factories started popping up. There was about a 50-year pause, the 50-year gap. Sometimes they call it Engels' pause, because Engels was the economist who looked at it. Between when corporate profits started to rise and when worker wages started to rise. So what that means is that for the first 50 years of the Industrial Revolution, companies were making money hand over fist using this new technology, but workers were not seeing any of that. We're seeing very little of that relative to what the people who owned the factories were seeing. And that's bad. That's like not good. And we saw a lot of undesirable outcomes from that. We also have an example from the 20th century when factories started to automate. And this largely happened in sort of heavy manufacturing industries like automaking, various other industries that brought in robots to the factories. And this, by and large, happened in unionized industries where workers had collective bargaining power. They saw it coming. It's hard to invisibly automate a factory. You have to literally like lug in the machines. And so workers were able to quickly say, okay, that looks like something that is welding car parts. That's my job. Therefore, I am in trouble. And I'm going to start advocating for a different job or changes to my job to make it more secure. And by the way, we as the workers also, we know that this stuff is going to allow you guys in management to make a lot more money. And so we want a bigger piece of that pie. So in the 20th century, we actually did see wages rising roughly at the same time as corporate profits were rising. So I say that because I don't think we know yet which one of these paths we will take with AI. And I think that's still an open question, but I think, it's not a foregone conclusion that it's going to be good for workers or bad for workers. It kind of depends on how we do it.
Huge opportunities for us to identify what economic health of the future could look like. I mean, if the world is one where many of us just chill and let the machines do the work, that's not really the way the world is, as we know. There are real material effects that this digital world is putting together, from industrial work at Foxconn to miners in the Congo to gig work out here, right? But we're at this amazing flashpoint. So, Kevin, just final question for you, and I'm really appreciative for your time today to talk with us. Who are some of the writers or journalists or like books that you've written? How can we keep up with the work that you're doing, your podcasts, of course? Help us with some good places to look to learn more about some of these issues, other than stuff that I might have mentioned. And tell us a little bit about where you're heading as a journalist, right? Like, you've broken these major stories, right? Like Discord and Charlottesville, OpenAI, or I'm sorry, GPT and I Want to Be Free. It sounds like a song, actually. GPT and I Want to Be Free. And maybe the last thing, I know this is a multi-part question. The last thing is, what can we all do? There's a sense that many of us have that we feel powerless in light of these opaque technological transformations where we really know nothing about what's actually occurring other than interacting with it.
Yeah, I'll sort of take the last part first, because I think that's a really important question. I think we all have more agency than we think in shaping how the future unfolds when it comes to AI specifically, but technology in general. A lot of the rules around this stuff are still unwritten. We saw just the other week, I mean, my employer, the New York Times, is suing OpenAI and Microsoft for copyright infringement, and is trying to sort of bring these practices of training on copyrighted data out into the open and to sort of litigate them. That's an example of how the future is sort of contingent on some decisions that companies or judges or juries will make. I think they're also, these companies are very sensitive to user feedback, and so a lot of what has led to changes in the way that these AI models are built and developed is just people telling them, like, we don't like, this feels creepy, or this feels weird, or this doesn't feel good, or I want it to be able to do X, Y, or Z better. I think that playing around with this stuff firsthand is really important. I talk to a lot of business leaders and people in government, and they'd say, how do we get involved? And I say, well, you got to use this stuff. And they say, well, I have a task force, or I have an assistant, or I have a committee, and they're playing around with it, and they're going to report back to me. And I always tell them, like, no. You got to roll up your sleeves. You got to make an account. You got to, pay for the pro version so that you're getting the best model. And you just have to spend, I think it's my estimation, it's about 5 hours you have to spend with these tools before you really get an intuitive sense for what they can and can't do. And that is just such an important starting point for everyone, no matter who you are or sort of what your level of comfort with this stuff is. And so I would say, as far as what you can do, you can start using this stuff, get a sense for how it works, get up to speed on it. You don't have to become like a machine learning PhD, but just use the tools and then talk about your experience with your friends, with your legislators, with your, with whoever you feel needs to hear it. That is a really important, public feedback is a really important part of the process of developing any new technology, but especially one like AI. And then as far as where people can keep up with me, I have a podcast. It comes out every Friday called Hard Fork, hosted with Casey Newton. I also write in the New York Times. And I, from my own knowledge of AI, I rely a lot on newsletters. There's some great newsletters. There's one called Import AI that's written by my friend Jack Clark. That's very good. It's sort of news of the week in AI. There are a bunch of other good ones out there. And that's where I get a lot of my my news about AI.
Where will you be heading with some of your reporting, kind of in the near and longer term future? Like, what can we kind of expect, or can we expect something, or is it all going to be improvisational because this whole world is so shape shifting?
Yeah, I try not to do too much predicting of that because I'm just constantly wrong. Like a couple years ago, I thought I was going to be like a full-time crypto columnist, and then the crypto industry crashed, and so it was like not where the story was anymore. So I try to follow the story. Right now, that feels like AI is the big story in the tech world, but we'll see. If AI dies or something else comes up that's more interesting, I'll try to pivot and go there.
Thank you so much for joining us, Kevin. Thank you for joining the Utopias podcast. Excited to continue to be in dialogue. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. That's podcastutopias@gmail.com. See you all next time.